In 1966, inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Central Intelligence Agency, a decision was made to classify a manuscript written by an engineer named John Thomas. It wasn't a blueprint for a nuclear weapon, nor was it a list of Soviet spies embedded in the Pentagon. It was a book about history, geology, and the terrifying mechanism that resets civilization like clockwork. For 50 years, the Adam and Eve story remained locked in the vaults of Langley, hidden from public eyes, labeled as a threat to national security. Why would the government fear a theory about the Earth's crust? Because it contained a truth so shattering that the powers that be believed society would crumble if it were known. It describes a planet that is not stable, but volatile. A crust that does not drift slowly over millions of years, but slips violently in a matter of hours, turning jungles into poles and oceans into mountains. They hid the schedule of the apocalypse. But now the files are open, the magnetic north is racing, and the signs are everywhere. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The story begins not with a bang, but with a digital paper trail that leads straight into the dark heart of the American intelligence apparatus. In 2013, the Central Intelligence Agency, responding to a Freedom of Information Act request, quietly released a digital copy of a document that had been gathering dust in their classified archives for nearly 5 decades. The document was a scanned version of a book titled The Adam and Eve Story, written by a man named John Thomas. At first glance, the release seemed innocuous, perhaps even a clerical error. The CIA's reading room is typically filled with declassified reports on Cold War espionage, MK-Ultra experiments, and geopolitical strategy papers. To find a book about geology, ancient history, and biblical interpretation sitting alongside reports on the KGB and nuclear proliferation is an anomaly that immediately raises red flags for any serious investigator. When researchers opened the PDF, they found a document that had been heavily sanitized. The digital stamp on the cover was clear: classified. The release was incomplete, containing only 57 pages of what was originally a much larger manuscript. The question that ignited the internet and the conspiracy community was simple but profound. Why? Why would the CIA, an agency tasked with protecting national security and gathering foreign intelligence, care about a book that discusses the shifting of the Earth's poles and the translation of Genesis? Geology is not a state secret. The history of the Earth is supposed to be the domain of universities and museums, not the domain of spies and black-budget operators. The very existence of this file in the CIA archives suggests that the information contained within it was weaponized, or at the very least considered dangerous enough to the social order that it had to be suppressed. To understand the weight of this censorship, we have to look at the author himself. John Thomas was not a science fiction writer, nor was he a raving lunatic shouting on a street corner. He was an insider. He was an electrical engineer who worked for McDonnell Douglas, one of the primary defense contractors for the United States Air Force. He was deeply embedded in the military-industrial complex during the height of the space race and the Cold War. He had access to data, specialized knowledge, and circles of influence that the average citizen could only dream of. In the 1960s, Thomas was also a Doctor of Divinity, a title that suggests a man trying to bridge the gap between the hard sciences of his day job and the esoteric mysteries of the human soul. When a man with top-secret clearance writes a book claiming that the world ends on a cyclical schedule, and his employers, the very people building the rockets and the bunkers, decide to lock that book away, we are no longer dealing with a theory. We are dealing with a leak. The 57 pages that were released are a fragmented, disjointed, yet terrifying glimpse into a catastrophic reality. The fact that the agency released a sanitized version implies that the full version contains details that remain too sensitive for public consumption even 50 years later. What was cut out? Did Thomas predict specific dates? Did he reveal the location of the safe zones? Or did he expose the fact that the government has known about the coming shift for decades and has been silently preparing while keeping the rest of the world in the dark? The timing of the classification is equally suspicious. 1966 was a pivotal year. The Cold War was freezing over, the space race was sprinting towards the moon, and the government was obsessed with continuity of government. They were building deep underground military bases, ostensibly to survive a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. But the Adam and Eve story suggests a different motivation. If the leadership knew that the surface of the Earth was periodically scrubbed clean by a geological cataclysm, the nuclear threat becomes secondary. The bunkers weren't just for radiation, they were for the wind and the water. The classification of Thomas's book aligns with the ethos of the Brookings Report, a document commissioned by NASA around the same time, which famously suggested that the discovery of extraterrestrial life or advanced ancient civilizations should be withheld from the public to prevent social disintegration. The logic is cold and utilitarian. If you tell the population that their civilization is a temporary sandcastle waiting for the tide, the stock market crashes, laws lose their meaning, and the workforce stops turning the gears of the economy. To keep the machine running, the people must believe that the ground beneath their feet is solid and eternal. Thomas threatened that illusion. He threatened the fundamental stability of the modern world view, which is built on the doctrine of uniformitarianism, the belief that geological changes happen agonizingly slowly over millions of years. The sanitized document itself is a strange artifact. It includes a handwritten note on the cover, scrawled in the bureaucratic shorthand of a censor. Inside, the text jumps. Pages are missing, and the flow of the narrative is interrupted. However, what remains is potent. Thomas writes with the urgency of a whistleblower. He dedicates the book to the greatest generation, but his message is not one of hope, but of warning. He challenges the established scientific community, calling out the dogma of the universities that refuse to look at the evidence of sudden, violent change. He cites the work of Charles Hapgood, a professor whose theory of Earth crust displacement was endorsed by none other than Albert Einstein. But Thomas takes Hapgood's theory and accelerates it. Where Hapgood saw a slide that took thousands of years, Thomas saw a snap that took hours. The CIA didn't hide Hapgood's work, perhaps because it was academic enough to be ignored by the masses. But Thomas's work was visceral, accessible, and terrifyingly plausible. He combined science with religion, translating the Bible not as a book of moral fables, but as a survival manual left behind by the last group of survivors. By classifying this specific synthesis of data, the CIA effectively admitted that there is validity to the claim. They don't classify fiction. They classify facts that are dangerous. As we examine the legacy of this suppressed file, we have to consider the environment of the era. The 1960s was a time when humanity was looking outward, trying to conquer space. But Thomas was looking inward at the molten core of our own planet. He proposed that the trigger for our destruction lies deep beneath us, in the electromagnetic relationship between the Earth and the Sun. The classification creates a vacuum of information that forces us to ask, what did the government see in the ice core samples? What did they find in the sediment layers of the ocean floor that corroborated Thomas's wild claims? The 57 pages are the breadcrumbs. The fact that the rest of the loaf is still hidden suggests that we are still on the timeline. We are still living in the period of quiet before the mechanism engages again. The story of the file is just the prologue. The real story is the cataclysm itself, a nightmare scenario that Thomas describes with the precision of an engineer and the horror of a prophet, a scenario that turns the laws of physics into a weapon against humanity. The silence of the CIA speaks louder than any disclosure. They hid the book because the book says that time is running out, and unlike a nuclear war, you cannot sign a treaty with the laws of geophysics. The file is open now, but the question remains. Is it too late to read the warning? To truly grasp the horror of the document hidden by the CIA, we must abandon every preconceived notion we have about natural disasters. When we hear the word cataclysm, we think of a hurricane flooding a city, an earthquake leveling a region, or a volcano burying a town. These are localized events. They are tragic, but they are survivable, and they leave the rest of the world intact to send aid. The scenario outlined in the Adam and Eve story is fundamentally different. It is not an event that happens on the Earth. It is an event that happens to the entire Earth. John Thomas paints a picture of a planetary reset that does not take place over centuries of slow climate change, but occurs with the sudden, violent snap of a finger. The premise relies on the physical reality that the Earth is spinning at roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. Everything on the surface, the oceans, the atmosphere, the mountains, and our cities, is held in place by gravity and momentum, moving in perfect sync with the rotation. But Thomas asks the terrifying question: what happens if the inner mechanism of the planet stutters? What happens if the shell of the Earth, the thin crust we live on, suddenly detaches from the molten core and slides? It is the equivalent of slamming on the brakes in a car traveling at supersonic speeds, but the passengers are the continents, and the windshield is the atmosphere. The event begins not with a warning siren, but with a shudder deep within the planet's mantle. According to Thomas, the trigger creates a lubricant layer between the solid core and the semi-solid mantle, allowing the crust to slip. In an instant, the magnetic poles disconnect from the geographic poles. The sun, which appeared to be setting in the west, suddenly stops and appears to race backward across the sky, or plunge below the horizon in seconds. This is the visual confirmation that the crust is moving independently of the core. But the visual horror is the least of humanity's problems. The first physical impact is the wind. The atmosphere is a fluid mass. It has mass and inertia. If the solid Earth beneath it suddenly shifts position by thousands of miles in a matter of hours, The atmosphere cannot keep up immediately. It continues to rotate at its original speed and direction while the ground moves beneath it. The result is a supersonic windstorm that defies comprehension. We are not talking about a Category 5 hurricane with winds of 160 miles per hour. We are talking about a wall of air moving at over 1,000 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. This wind does not just blow down trees, it atomizes them. It shreds skyscrapers like they are made of wet tissue paper. It scours the surface of the earth, stripping away topsoil, forests, and structures down to the bedrock. A human being standing in the open would not be blown away. They would be liquefied by the sheer pressure and friction of the air. This is the breath of God mentioned in ancient texts, the wind that swept over the face of the waters. Following the wind comes the water. The oceans, like the atmosphere, possess immense inertia. When the crust lurches, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans do not simply sit still. They slosh. Imagine running with a shallow pan of water and then suddenly stopping. The water flies out of the pan. Now scale that up to a basin thousands of miles wide and miles deep. The oceans effectively stand up. 2-mile-high walls of water, darker than night and heavy with sediment, crash over the continents. This is not a tsunami that hits the coast and recedes. This is a continental deluge. The Pacific Ocean washes over the Andes and the Rockies, scrubbing North and South America clean. The Atlantic crashes over Europe and Africa. These massive bodies of water carry the debris of the destroyed civilization. The twisted steel of cities, the pulverized rock of mountains, and the bodies of billions of beings, and churn them into a thick, uniform slurry. As the water rushes across the land, it picks up dirt and rocks, turning into a liquid sandpaper that erodes everything in its path. When the waters finally recede days or weeks later, they leave behind layers of mud hundreds of feet thick, burying the evidence of the previous world so deep that future archaeologists will assume nothing ever existed there. This explains the mud flood myths found in every culture on Earth. It explains why we find seashells on the tops of mountains. It wasn't that the sea level rose slowly. It was that the ocean was thrown onto the roof of the world. Simultaneously, the Earth itself is screaming. The stress of the crust sliding over the mantle causes the tectonic plates to buckle and snap. Every volcano on the planet erupts at once, spewing ash and lava into the supersonic winds, creating a hellscape of fire and ice. New mountain ranges are thrust upward in hours as plates collide, while old lands sink beneath the waves. The noise of this geological torture would be deafening, a constant roar of cracking rock and exploding magma that would rupture eardrums instantly. The friction generates immense heat, melting glaciers in one region while creating flash freezes in others. This is the most bizarre aspect of the shift, the sudden relocation of climates. A landmass sitting on the equator, basking in tropical heat, is suddenly thrust into the polar circle. The temperature drops from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees below zero in the span of an afternoon. The rain turning to snow, then to solid ice, entombing everything in a cryostatic preservation. This is how you get a tropical rainforest buried under the Antarctic ice sheet. This is how you get animals frozen mid-stride. The climate didn't change. The location of the land changed. In the aftermath of this violence, which Thomas suggests lasts only a fraction of a day, perhaps 6 to 12 hours for the main shift, the world is unrecognizable. The geography has been redrawn. The sun rises in a new location. The stars are different. The civilization that spent thousands of years building internet cables, power grids, and skyscrapers is gone, erased as if it were a drawing on an etch-a-sketch that was shaken too hard. The survivors are few, scattered in high-altitude caves or fortuitous pockets of calm known as null zones. They are stripped of their technology, their history, and their dignity. They are thrust back into the Stone Age, forced to hunt with sticks and hide from the elements. Over generations, the memory of the skyscrapers and the airplanes fades into myth. The flying chariots of the gods and the towers of Babel become legends of a golden age that was destroyed by the anger of the heavens. The mud solidifies into rock, hiding the plastic and the steel of our lives. The Adam and Eve story begins again, not with the first humans, but with the first survivors of the last turn of the wheel. This is the scenario the CIA wanted to hide. It renders politics, economics, and war utterly meaningless. It reveals that we are living in a temporary housing project built on a shifting foundation, and the eviction notice has already been written by the laws of physics. To dismiss the apocalypse scenario, described by Chan Thomas as the raving of a lunatic, is the initial instinct of the rational mind. But to understand why the Central Intelligence Agency took his work so seriously, we must pivot from the visceral horror of the wind and water to the cold, hard physics of the planet we live on. The mechanism of the cataclysm is not magic. It is mechanics. It is based on a fundamental misunderstanding that the general public has about the structure of the Earth. We are taught in grade school that the Earth is a solid rock, stable and unyielding. This is a lie. In reality, we are living on a precarious, thin shell, floating on a sea of molten glass and iron. To visualize the mechanism of the slip, we must look at the Earth crust displacement theory, championed by Professor Charles Hapgood and endorsed by Albert Einstein. But Chan Thomas takes this theory and adds the critical trigger that turns a slow drift into a sudden snap. The analogy often used is that of an orange. The fruit inside is the core and the mantle. The skin outside is the crust, or the lithosphere. If the skin is attached firmly to the fruit, they spin together. But if the skin becomes loose, or if a lubricant is introduced between the skin and the fruit, the skin can slide around the fruit even while the fruit continues to spin at its original axis. This is exactly what Thomas proposes happens to the Earth. The crust detaches from the mantle and rotates independently to find a new center of gravity. The primary driver of this instability is a force we deal with every day but rarely consider in a planetary context: centrifugal force. As the Earth spins on its axis, it creates a bulge at the equator. It wants to throw mass outward. A perfectly balanced spinning top will spin smoothly. But the Earth is not perfectly balanced. It has a massive, chaotic weight attached to one of its ends: the Antarctic ice sheet. This is not just a patch of snow. It is a continent-sized slab of ice, miles thick, weighing quadrillions of tons. Furthermore, this ice mass is not perfectly centered on the geographic South Pole. It is eccentric. It sits off-kilter. As the Earth spins, this massive off-center weight creates a tremendous amount of torque. It is constantly pulling the crust, trying to drag the heavy ice mass toward the equator to relieve the stress, just as a spinning skater's arms are pulled outward. For thousands of years, the friction between the crust and the mantle, the glue of the planet, is strong enough to resist this pull. The crust groans, earthquakes happen, but it holds. The ice pulls, and the friction holds. It is a stalemate. But like any stalemate, it only lasts until one side loses its grip. This is where John Thomas introduces the trigger, and this is the specific science that likely terrified the intelligence community. He argues that the friction holding the crust in place is not just mechanical, it is electromagnetic. The Earth's core is a dynamo, a swirling ball of molten iron and nickel that generates the magnetic field protecting us from solar radiation. This magnetic field passes through the mantle and the crust, acting as a binding agent. In the field of physics known as magnetohydrodynamics, MHD, we know that a strong magnetic field can increase the viscosity of a fluid, making it act more like a solid. As long as the Earth's magnetic field is strong, the semi-molten layer between the crust and the mantle, the asthenosphere, remains thick and sticky, locking the crust in place. It acts as a magnetic brake. But the Earth's magnetic field is not constant. It breathes, it fluctuates, and periodically it collapses. Thomas posits that when the magnetic field weakens to a critical point, a null zone, the magnetohydrodynamic effect evaporates. The viscosity of the asthenosphere drops instantly. The glue turns into a lubricant. The molten rock becomes slippery as oil. In that terrifying moment of magnetic null, the stalemate breaks. The centrifugal force, which has been waiting for thousands of years, finally wins. The torque exerted by the massive, off-balance ice caps takes over. There is nothing holding the crust back anymore. The entire outer shell of the Earth, North America, Asia, Europe, the oceans, and the ice caps, lurches. It is not the core that moves. The core keeps spinning its merry way. It is the shell that slides over the lubricated interior. The heavy ice caps of Antarctica and Greenland are thrown toward the equator by the spin of the Earth. This is the slip. It is a seek for equilibrium. The laws of physics demand that the heaviest weights be at the furthest point from the axis of rotation. So, the poles become the equator. The equator becomes the poles. The slip continues until the heavy ice mass reaches the bulge of the equator, stabilizing the spin. This movement covers roughly 90 degrees of latitude. A point that was at the North Pole ends up at the equator. A point that was at the equator ends up at the North Pole. This explains the flash-frozen mammoths in Siberia. They weren't walking in a tundra that slowly got colder. They were walking in a temperate zone that was physically shoved into the Arctic Circle in a matter of hours. Once the shift is complete and the heavy weights are stabilized at the equator, the core's dynamo eventually resets. The magnetic field returns, the viscosity of the mantle increases, and the crust locks back into place in its new position. The orange peel is glued back onto the fruit. The survivors, crawling out of their caves, look up to see a new North Star. The constellations have rotated. The sun rises over a new horizon. The cycle of the Adam and Eve story begins anew. The scary part of Thomas's theory is the inevitability of it. It is not an if, but a when. The accumulation of ice at the poles is a constant process. The weakening of the magnetic field is a measurable phenomenon. We are currently watching the magnetic North Pole race across the Arctic at unprecedented speeds, and the field strength is dropping by 5% per decade. We are, according to the physics of the slip, priming the trigger mechanism right now. The gun is loaded, the safety is off, and the ice is getting heavier every day. The Earth is a time bomb, and the timer is set by the very magnetic field that guides our compasses. When the compass stops working, the world stops working. If the physics of the crustal slip is the engine of the catastrophe, then the forensic evidence left behind is the crime scene, and the most damning piece of evidence in this geological murder mystery was discovered in 1900 along the banks of the Berezovka River in Siberia. It was here that a local Lamut tribesman stumbled upon the tusk of a woolly mammoth protruding from the frozen cliffside. When the Russian Academy of Sciences arrived to excavate the beast, they didn't just find a skeleton. They found a time capsule preserved in a state of suspended animation so perfect it defied all biological logic. This was the Berezovka mammoth. It wasn't a fossil. It was a mummy. The flesh was still intact. The hair was still on the hide. The meat was so fresh that, according to the expedition reports, the sled dogs accompanying the scientists eagerly devoured chunks of the thawed flesh, and the scientists themselves remarked that the meat looked appetizing enough to eat, though they wisely refrained. But the horror and the wonder of the Berezovka mammoth lay not in its preservation, but in the details of its death. It hadn't died of old age. It hadn't been picked clean by scavengers. It had died instantly, in the middle of a sentence, so to speak. The autopsy of the creature revealed a set of circumstances that destroys the standard model of slow, gradual climate change. First, the mammoth had a broken hip and pelvis, suggesting it had been slammed violently by a massive force or dropped from a height while the ground was heaving beneath it. But the real revelation was inside its mouth and stomach. When scientists examined the contents of its digestive tract, they found over 30 pounds of undigested vegetation. Between its teeth, they found the remains of sedges, grasses, and most critically, buttercups. The presence of buttercups, ranunculus, is the key. These are delicate, flowering plants that bloom in the middle of summer. They do not grow in the Arctic tundra. They grow in temperate, lush meadows. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that at the moment of its death, this mammoth was not trekking through a blizzard in a frozen wasteland. It was grazing in a warm, sunny pasture, likely somewhere with a climate similar to modern-day central Canada or northern Europe. It was enjoying a summer afternoon. Here is the impossible physics problem that keeps uniformitarian geologists awake at night. How do you take a 6-ton animal standing in a warm meadow eating flowers and freeze it solid so quickly that the food in its mouth doesn't rot and the food in its stomach doesn't digest? Digestion in a mammal continues even after death until the body temperature drops. To preserve the cell structure of the buttercups in the mouth and the stomach lining, the temperature of the mammoth had to plummet from a comfortable summer warmth to deep freeze conditions in a matter of hours, if not minutes. We are talking about a flash freeze. Engineers have calculated that to freeze a biomass of that size, essentially a 6-ton meat locker, all the way to the core before decomposition sets in, you would need an ambient temperature of roughly 150 to 175 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Such temperatures do not exist on Earth naturally, not even at the South Pole in the dead of winter. A slow-moving ice age cannot do this. If the climate cooled down over years or centuries, the mammoth would have migrated south. If it got caught in a standard blizzard, it would have died of exposure, but its internal heat would have lingered long enough for the stomach bacteria to break down the flowers. The Berezovka mammoth didn't freeze because the weather changed. It froze because the world moved. This aligns perfectly with John Thomas's scenario of the crustal slip. Imagine the mammoth grazing in a temperate zone at a latitude of perhaps 45 degrees north. Suddenly, the trigger engages. The crust detaches. The ground beneath the mammoth's feet lurches and begins to race towards the Arctic Circle at hundreds of miles per hour. The atmosphere, carrying that supersonic wind we discussed, slams into the creature, breaking its hip and suffocating it instantly with a pressure wave. As the landmass physically slides into the polar zone, the temperate air is stripped away and replaced by the vacuum of space descending, or the supercooled air of the pole. The temperature drops 200 degrees in a flash. The mammoth is effectively dipped in liquid nitrogen. It is frozen in mid-chew. The mud and water swept up by the cataclysm encase the body, protecting it from scavengers, and the new polar location ensures it stays frozen for 12,000 years until a river erodes the bank and reveals the truth. The Berezovka discovery is not an anomaly. It is part of a pattern. In the new Siberian islands, explorers have found islands that are practically made of mammoth bones, mixed with the remains of saber-toothed tigers, rhinoceroses, and antelope, animals that have no business being in the Arctic. These muck pits are mass graves. They are the debris fields where the tidal waves of the cataclysm deposited the biological refuse of an entire continent. The sheer density of the bones suggests a sudden, violent event that rounded up millions of animals and dumped them in a heap. The standard textbooks tell us these animals were adapted to the cold, hence the woolly coat. But elephants grow hair, too. It's not necessarily for Arctic survival. And a fur coat does not help you find tons of vegetation to eat in a land of perpetual ice. A mammoth needs hundreds of pounds of food a day. The Arctic tundra cannot support that biomass. The only logical explanation is that the land was not Arctic when they lived there. It was a green, fertile steppe that was tragically relocated to the top of the world. The frozen buttercups in the mouth of the Berezovka beast are the silent scream of a world that ended in a single day. They are the undeniable proof that the map of the world is not permanent, and that the Adam and Eve cycle is real. The CIA knew that if people understood the implications of a frozen flower, the illusion of stability would shatter. If you accept the terrifying reality of the crustal slip, the wind, the water, and the sudden freezing, then you must also accept the devastating conclusion that Chan Thomas draws about human history. We are not the first. We are not the apex of evolution. We are merely the survivors of the 6th or perhaps the 7th attempt at civilization on this planet. Modern academia, bound by the slow-moving timeline of Darwinian evolution, teaches us that humanity progressed linearly from hunter-gatherers to farmers, to city builders, and finally to astronauts. It is a straight line of progress, but Thomas argues that history is not a line, it is a loop. It is a record that skips. Every 6,000 to 7,000 years, the needle is ripped off the vinyl, and the song starts over from silence. The survivors of the cataclysm, stripped of their technology and their infrastructure, are forced back into the Stone Age. They do not invent stone tools because they are primitive. They use stone tools because that is all that is left when the power grid goes down, and the factories are buried under a mile of mud. Over thousands of years, the memory of the previous world fades into legend. The skyscrapers become the towers of Babel. The airplanes become the chariots of fire. The advanced medical knowledge becomes magic. And we, the arrogant children of the current cycle, look at the megalithic ruins left behind and wonder how primitive people moved 1,000-ton blocks, refusing to admit that they were not primitive at all. They were us, but better. The evidence for this lost timeline is scattered across the globe, impossible to explain with the standard model, but perfectly consistent with a planetary shift. Look at Tiahuanaco in Bolivia. Situated at an altitude of 13,000 feet in the Andes, it is a desolate, wind-swept ruin. Yet, the archaeology tells a story that defies gravity. The ruins contain massive stone wharves and piers, unmistakable structures designed for a busy seaport. But there is no sea. Lake Titicaca is miles away and shrinking. Even more baffling, the area is littered with millions of fossilized seashells and the remains of ocean creatures. Uniformitarian geologists try to explain this by saying the Andes rose slowly over millions of years. But the ruins of Tiahuanaco are not millions of years old. They are thousands. This implies that Tiahuanaco was once at sea level, a thriving port city on the coast of the Pacific or the Atlantic. Then, in the violence of a crustal slip, the entire South American plate was buckled and thrust upward. The city was lifted 2 miles into the sky in a geological instant. The force of the uplift shattered the massive stone blocks, tossing 100-ton monoliths around like Lego bricks. The Gate of the Sun, a single block of andesite weighing 10 tons, is cracked down the middle, a testament to a seismic event of apocalyptic magnitude. The people of Tiahuanaco didn't abandon their city. They were elevated to death. Move across the ocean to Egypt, and the timeline breaks again. We are told the Sphinx was built by the pharaoh Khafra around 2500 BC. But the geology of the Sphinx enclosure screams of a much older date. Geologist Robert Schoch proved that the body of the Sphinx and the walls surrounding it show distinct signs of vertical water erosion, deep fissures caused by centuries of heavy, torrential rainfall. The problem is that the Sahara has been a bone-dry desert for at least 5,000 years. To find a climate in Egypt capable of producing that kind of weathering, you have to go back to the end of the last ice age, around 10,500 BC, or perhaps even earlier, to a time before the last shift. This aligns with Chan Thomas's theory that the Sphinx is not a monument of the current cycle, but a survivor of the previous one. It was built when Egypt was a lush tropical rainforest, or a temperate zone, long before the crust slid south and the desert took over. The head of the Sphinx, which is disproportionately small and shows less erosion, was likely recarved by the dynastic Egyptians, who found this ancient monument protruding from the sands and claimed it for themselves. They were not the builders. They were the squatters living in the ruins of the gods. The mud flood aspect of the cataclysm also explains why so much of our history is buried. When the oceans wash over the continents, they don't just bring water. They bring a slurry of soil, rock, and debris. When the waters recede, they leave behind a sedimentary blanket that can be hundreds of feet thick. This is why archaeologists always have to dig down to find the past. Why would a city be 20 feet underground? Did the people slowly let dirt accumulate in their living rooms? No, they were buried. Look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, deliberately buried under a mountain of soil. Or look at the strange, underground floors of older buildings in cities like Seattle or Moscow, where the first floors are now basements. The standard explanation is raising the street level, but the catastrophic explanation is that the world was inundated with mud. We are literally walking on the roof of the previous civilization. The technological anomalies found in coal seams, gold chains, iron pots, and metallic spheres found in rock layers dated to millions of years old are not evidence of time travel. They are evidence that the geological dating methods are flawed because they assume the rock layers were laid down slowly, rather than being churned up and redeposited violently by a global flood. John Thomas's The Adam and Eve story challenges the ego of the human race. It suggests that the progress we are so proud of, our iPhones, our internet, our space stations, is just a fleeting moment of calm. We are building sandcastles at low tide. The previous civilizations, the ones who built the pyramids with laser-like precision, who mapped the stars with impossible accuracy, and who likely had power sources we can only dream of, thought they were eternal too. They thought they had conquered nature. And then the magnetic field collapsed, the ice caps pulled the trigger, and they were erased. The lost timeline is not lost because we can't find it. It is lost because we are afraid to look at it. To acknowledge it is to acknowledge our own mortality. The CIA classified Thomas's book because it reveals that the rise and fall of civilizations is not a metaphor for politics. It is a literal, mechanical description of the Earth's violent heartbeat. We are the orphans of a dead world, trying to reconstruct the memory of our parents from the few stone photographs they left behind before the lights went out. If John Thomas's geological theories were enough to get him flagged by the CIA, his theological interpretations were likely what got him classified as a threat to the social fabric. In the Adam and Eve story, Thomas commits what many would consider blasphemy, but what he considered the ultimate act of translation. He argues that the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, is not a metaphorical fairy tale about the creation of the universe from nothing. Instead, he posits that it is a literal eyewitness account of the recovery following the last cataclysm. When the text says, "In the beginning," it doesn't mean the beginning of time. It means the beginning of this cycle. It means day one after the smoke cleared and the waters receded. The void and the darkness upon the face of the deep described in the first verses are not the emptiness of space. They are the literal description of the Earth's atmosphere choked with volcanic ash, dust, and thick cloud cover following the supersonic winds and the global firestorm. The sun was blocked out. The light was gone. For the survivors crawling out of the caves, the world was formless and void because it had been scrubbed clean of all landmarks. When the light finally appeared, it wasn't God creating the sun. It was the atmosphere finally settling enough for the survivors to see the sky again. Thomas argues that the story of Adam and Eve is not the story of the first two humans ever created. It is the story of the first two survivors of the Adamic cycle, a specific group of humans who preserved the knowledge or the genetics of the previous age. The name Adam in Hebrew is often linked to Adamah, meaning ground or earth, and Eve to life. They are the life form, the earth. the people who emerged from the mud and the underground shelters to repopulate a devastated planet. The Garden of Eden was not a magical paradise. It was likely a null zone, or a protected valley that had been spared the worst of the wind and water, a place where vegetation still existed while the rest of the world was a wasteland. The fall of man was not about eating a piece of fruit. It was the loss of the high civilization status. Humanity fell from a state of technological grace back into the hard labor of agriculture and survival. They were cast out of the garden because the climate changed violently during the shift, turning their temperate paradise into a desert or a tundra, forcing them to toil in the dust to survive. But the most controversial and explosive part of Thomas's manuscript concerns the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas dedicates a significant portion of his work to what he calls the missing years of Jesus, the period between the ages of 12 and 30 that are completely silent in the canonical Gospels. Drawing on controversial texts and traditions from India and Tibet, such as the writings of Nicholas Notovich regarding Saint Isa, Thomas proposes that Jesus traveled to the east, specifically to the Himalayas and the Naga libraries of India. There, he didn't just study spirituality. He studied the ancient sciences. He studied the history of the cataclysms. Thomas frames Jesus not merely as a religious messiah, but as a master scientist, a man who understood the laws of nature, the law of the cycle. He learned that the earth was due for another reset. His teachings, therefore, were not just moral platitudes. They were urgent warnings. When Jesus spoke of the end of the age, often mistranslated as the end of the world, he was speaking literally of the end of the current geological epoch. When he described the stars falling from the sky and the sun turning to sackcloth, he was describing the visual phenomena of a pole shift, the crust moving so fast that the stars appear to streak and fall, and the volcanic ash blotting out the sun. Thomas goes even further, reinterpreting the very last moments of Jesus on the cross. The famous cry, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," is traditionally translated as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This paints a picture of a broken, despairing man. But Thomas argues this is a mistranslation of the Aramaic or Hebrew tongue. He suggests the phrase is actually Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, or a similar phonetic derivative relating to the sun or the Helios. Thomas suggests Jesus was not complaining to God. He was making a final scientific observation about the darkening sky, or perhaps acknowledging the inevitability of the cycle, that the sun, the light of the age, was fading. While linguistic scholars vehemently disagree with this, Thomas's point is to reframe Jesus as a figure of intellect rather than just faith. He argues that Jesus came to prepare humanity's soul for the inevitable transition, teaching that while the physical world is subject to destruction, the fire next time, the spirit is the only thing that survives the shift. The kingdom of heaven is the state of consciousness that transcends the physical upheaval of the planet. This recontextualization of the Bible transforms the text from a book of worship into a book of data. The angel with the flaming sword, guarding the way to the tree of life, becomes a metaphor for the plasma discharges, or the solar phenomena, that accompany the magnetic reversal, barring humanity from reclaiming their lost high technology. The Tower of Babel becomes the story of a post-cataclysm civilization trying to rebuild too quickly, trying to reach the heavens, space or high technology, before they were morally ready, and being scattered by another minor geological or social event. Thomas suggests that the confusion of tongues was the result of isolated groups of survivors losing contact with each other and developing separate dialects over millennia. The CIA's interest in this interpretation is obvious. If religion is actually a coded history of planetary destruction, then the billions of religious people on Earth are sitting on the truth without realizing it. If the government were to admit that Judgment Day is a geophysical event scheduled by the Earth's core, it would validate every doomsday prophecy in every holy book, causing mass panic. By keeping the Adam and Eve story classified, they keep the Bible in the realm of faith and out of the realm of science, ensuring that the population keeps praying for salvation rather than preparing for survival. If the geology provides the how and the frozen mammoth provides the what, then the mathematics of the cycle provides the terrifying when. Chan Thomas did not just postulate a random series of disasters. He identified a rhythm, a heartbeat of destruction that pulses with mathematical precision. In the Adam and Eve story, he outlines a timeline that challenges the linear progression of history taught in our schools. He proposes that the cataclysmic shift of the Earth's crust is not a freak accident, but a recurring event that happens roughly every 6,500 to 7,000 years. This specific interval is the key to unlocking the panic of the intelligence community. If you accept this number, you suddenly realize that human history is not a long, unbroken road, but a series of short sprints between finish lines that are actually cliffs. To understand this, we have to look backward. If we start from our current position in the 21st century and subtract roughly 6,500 years, we land squarely in the window of 4,500 BC to 4,000 BC. This date range is significant. In biblical chronology, this is the era of Noah's flood. In geological terms, this corresponds to a period of rapid sea level rise and massive climatic fluctuation known as the Peora Oscillation. It was a time when the Old World was washed away, and the seeds of the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations, the first official civilizations of our current cycle, began to sprout from the mud. But if we jump back another 6,500 years from Noah, arriving at approximately 10,500 BC to 11,000 BC, we hit the motherlode of geological evidence. This is the date of the Adam and Eve event. It perfectly coincides with the end of the Younger Dryas period, the sudden, violent end of the last ice age. This was the moment the mammoths were frozen. This was the moment the water erosion on the Sphinx likely occurred due to torrential, tropical rains shifting to desert aridity. This was the moment the legendary Atlantis is said to have sunk beneath the waves in a single day and night, as described by Plato. The synchronization between Chan Thomas's calculated cycle and the hard data of paleoclimatology is chilling. The Adam cycle was the major reset, the one that wiped out the high-tech antediluvian world. The Noah cycle was perhaps a lesser adjustment, or a half-cycle, but still devastating enough to be remembered as a global flood. The existence of these evenly spaced markers suggests that the Earth is operating on a schedule. It is a harmonic oscillator. Just as a pendulum swings back and forth, the Earth's crust seeks equilibrium, snaps, settles, builds up tension, and snaps again. To understand why 6,500 years is the magic number, we have to look at the larger celestial mechanics, specifically the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles on its axis like a dying top. It takes roughly 25,920 years for the Earth to complete one full wobble. This is known as the Great Year. Ancient cultures were obsessed with this number. The Mayans, the Egyptians, and the Vedic astronomers all tracked it. If you divide the Great Year, 25,920, by 4, you get 6,480, remarkably close to Chan Thomas's 6,500-year figure. This suggests that the crustal slip is tied to the quarter points of the precessional cycle. As the Earth wobbles, there are 4 critical points of instability, perhaps gravitational aligners with the galactic center or solar magnetic triggers, that act as the release valve for the accumulated torque. We move through the zodiac ages: the age of Leo, the age of Taurus, the age of Pisces, and now the age of Aquarius. Each transition is not just a horoscope change, it is a violent shaking of the Etch-a-Sketch. The ancients didn't map the stars for fortune-telling. They mapped them to know how much time they had left on the lease. The magnetic record of the Earth supports this rhythmic violence. Geologists track magnetic excursions, periods where the Earth's magnetic field weakens significantly and the poles wander or flip. The Lachamp event, roughly 42,000 years ago, was a major excursion. The Gothenburg magnetic flip occurred around 12,000 years ago, matching the Adam event perfectly. There are shorter, sharper spikes of magnetic instability recorded in the lava flows and pottery shards of the last 6,000 years. These excursions are the heart attacks of the planet. Chan Thomas argued that the magnetic field is the holding mechanism. When the cycle hits its critical point, the field collapses, the excursion, the viscosity drops, and the crust moves. The terrifying implication of the 6,500-year cycle is where it places us right now. If the last major reset, Noah, was around 4,500 BC, and we add 6,500 years to that, we arrive at the window of 2000 to 2500 AD. We are living in the danger zone. We are mathematically overdue or right on the precipice of the next turn. This explains the urgency of the continuity of government programs that began in the mid-20th century. If the CIA and the scientific elite confirmed Thomas's math in the 1960s, they realized that the next event wasn't millions of years away. It was imminent. It explains why they built the seed vaults in Svalbard. It explains the feverish colonization of underground spaces. They know that the lease is up. The Adam and Eve story was classified because it is an expiration date. If you tell a population that they have 1,000 years, they build cathedrals. If you tell them they have 20 years, they burn the city down. The cycle renders all long-term human planning futile. Our retirement plans, our national borders, and our climate change treaties are all based on the assumption of a static Earth. But the Earth is not static. It is rhythmic. We are currently watching the magnetic field weaken at an accelerating rate, 10 times faster than previously predicted. We are watching the poles race. We are seeing the sun behave erratically. These are not random anomalies. They are the ticking of the clock as the hand approaches the midnight of the cycle. We are the generation living at the end of the sentence, waiting for the period to be placed so the next chapter can begin. While John Thomas focused heavily on the internal mechanics of the Earth, the molten layers and the magnetic breaks, he knew that the ultimate trigger for the cataclysm had to be extraterrestrial. The Earth does not exist in a vacuum. It is tethered to the sun by an invisible umbilical cord of gravity and electromagnetism. If the Earth is the gun and the ice caps are the bullet, then the sun is the finger on the trigger. In the Adam and Eve story, Thomas hints at a solar event that precedes the shift, but modern astrophysics has since filled in the terrifying blanks with a theory that aligns perfectly with his timeline. The solar micronova. This is not the supernova that destroys a star completely. It is a recurring, smaller explosion, a sneeze of the sun that happens cyclically. When the sun sheds its accumulated dust and plasma shell, it blasts the solar system with a wave of energy that is catastrophic for any planet in its path. This theory, championed by researchers like Douglas Vogt and Ben Davidson of Suspicious Zero Observers, suggests that our sun is not a steady yellow bulb, but a variable star with a 6,000 to 12,000 year heartbeat. The mechanism works like this. As the solar micronova erupts, it sends a physical shell of plasma and a massive electromagnetic shockwave racing toward Earth. This shockwave hits our planet's magnetic field first. Under normal circumstances, our magnetosphere deflects solar wind. But a micronova is a tsunami of energy. It overwhelms the shield. The induction of this massive electrical current into the Earth's core causes the core's magnetic field to unlock or reverse polarity instantly. This is the moment the viscosity drops, as Thomas predicted. The electromagnetic glue holding the crust to the mantle evaporates because the core is being electrocuted by the sun. Simultaneously, the physical impact of the solar wave pushes against the Earth, potentially acting as a brake on its rotation. If the rotation slows down or stops for even a moment while the momentum of the crust continues, the slip is magnified. This explains the biblical 3 days of darkness, or the stories of the sun standing still found in Joshua. These are not miracles. They are observations of the Earth's rotation being disrupted by a solar impact. The evidence for this solar trigger is burnt into the moon and the Earth. When the Apollo astronauts brought back rocks from the moon, they found glass. Not just volcanic glass, but tiny beads of impact glass found in craters on the surface. For years, this was attributed to micrometeorites. But closer analysis has shown that some of this glazing could be the result of a massive heat flash, a moment when the sun flared so hot it melted the lunar regolith. On Earth, we find similar evidence in the form of tektites and fulgurites, fused sand, scattered across vast areas, dated to these specific 12,000 and 6,000 year intervals. The Adam and Eve event wasn't just a windstorm, it was a scorcher. The side of the Earth facing the sun at the moment of the micronova would be baked. The ozone layer would be stripped away, allowing UV radiation to sterilize the surface. This explains the stories of fire from heaven and the burning of the world found in the Norse Ragnarok and the Greek story of Phaeton. This solar connection also explains the current erratic behavior of our environment. We are seeing an increase in auroras appearing further south. We are seeing Steve phenomena, purple atmospheric ribbons. We are seeing the Earth's magnetic field weaken. This is because the sun is changing. It is entering a state of magnetic hibernation, a precursor to the outburst. The weakening of the Earth's magnetic field is actually a symptom of the solar cycle. As the Sun's heliosphere, its protective bubble, weakens, more galactic cosmic rays enter the solar system, impacting our core and heating it up. This internal heating is what leads to the increase in volcanoes and earthquakes before the shift. The system is charging up. The solar trigger hypothesis transforms the cataclysm from a random geological accident into a predictable cosmic interaction. It means that the CIA wasn't just hiding a geology book. They were hiding an astronomy forecast. They know that the sun is the master clock, and when the alarm goes off, the Earth has no choice but to reset. If you take the mechanics of the crustal slip as a fact, that the shell of the Earth slides over the core, relocating continents to new latitudes, then you must ask the inevitable geographical question: which piece of land was the victim of the last shift? Which continent was sitting in the lush, temperate zone 12,000 years ago, only to be violently shoved into the deep freeze of the polar circle? Chan Thomas provides an answer that aligns with the oldest legends of humanity and the most baffling anomalies of cartography. Antarctica is Atlantis. For centuries, explorers have searched for Plato's lost city in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, or the mid-Atlantic ridge. They have been looking for a sunken island, but Thomas argues they should have been looking for a frozen continent. According to the Adam and Eve model, prior to the last cataclysm, the landmass we now call Antarctica was not situated at the South Pole. It was positioned roughly 2,000 miles further north, bathing in a climate similar to that of modern-day New Zealand or South Africa. It was a massive, fertile continent, home to the advanced antediluvian civilization that built the megaliths and mapped the stars. It was the hub of the prehistoric world. Then, the trigger pulled. The magnetic field collapsed, the micronova erupted, and the crust detached. In the span of a single horrifying day, the continent of Antarctica was dragged south by the centrifugal force of the shift. It didn't sink beneath the ocean. It sank into the polar zone. As it crossed the Antarctic Circle, the temperate atmosphere was stripped away, replaced by the crushing cold of the southern vortex. The lush forests, the flowing rivers, and the gleaming cities of Atlantis were not just flooded by the tidal waves. They were flash-frozen. The water that washed over them turned into ice instantly, entombing the entire civilization under a mile-thick shroud of white. This explains why we haven't found Atlantis underwater. We haven't found it because we are walking on top of it. The ruins are there, perfectly preserved, sealed in a cryostatic vault that no pickaxe can breach. The ringed city of Plato is likely sitting under the ice of the Wilkes Land anomaly, or the Neuschwabenland region, waiting for the ice to melt and reveal the truth. The evidence for this is not just theoretical. It is cartographic. We possess maps that should not exist. The most famous is the Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. Piri Reis noted that he drew his map from ancient source maps rescued from the Library of Alexandria before it burned. The map depicts the coastlines of South America and Africa with surprising accuracy, but the shocking detail is at the bottom. It shows the northern coastline of Antarctica, specifically Queen Maud Land. But it doesn't show ice. It shows estuaries, rivers, and mountain ranges. It depicts a habitable coast. Modern science tells us that Queen Maud Land has been covered in ice for millions of years. Yet, in 1949, a joint British-Swedish expedition performed seismic soundings of the area and found that the topography of the land under the ice matched the Piri Reis map perfectly. How could a 16th century admiral, or the ancient map makers he copied, know the shape of the land beneath a mile of ice? They couldn't, unless they drew the map before the ice was there, unless they drew the map before the shift. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 is even more explicit. It shows the entire continent of Antarctica with no ice cap. It shows mountain ranges, valleys, and rivers flowing into the sea. It places the South Pole in the interior of the continent, but free of the massive glacial accumulation we see today. This map suggests that there was a time, relatively recently in human history, when Antarctica was mapped by sailors who could circumnavigate it and land on its shores. Uniformitarian geologists dismiss these maps as lucky guesses or fantasies. But the mathematical precision of the coordinates suggests otherwise. These maps are the survivor documents Thomas talks about. They are the fragments of the lost timeline, preserved by the secret societies or the priesthoods of Egypt, passed down until they ended up in the hands of medieval cartographers who didn't even understand what they were drawing. They were copying the geography of the previous cycle. This theory reframes the modern obsession with Antarctica. Why did the Nazis launch an expensive expedition, New Swabia, to the continent in 1938, right before the war? Why did the United States send Admiral Byrd with a massive naval fleet in 1946, Operation High Jump? Why are world leaders, religious patriarchs, and top scientists constantly visiting the South Pole today? The official story is climate research and penguin studies. The Adam and Eve theory suggests they are looking for the technology of the fallen. If Atlantis was a high-tech civilization destroyed instantly by a freeze, then its libraries, its machines, and its power sources are intact. They aren't rusted away like the Titanic. They are preserved in the ice. The race for the Antarctic is a race to recover the heritage of the ancestors before the next shift buries us. The CIA classified Chan Thomas's book because he connected the dots. He pointed to the ice and said, "That is not a natural formation. That is a crime scene." Phew, he realized that the ice caps are not just climate regulators. They are the tomb of the gods. And as the ice melts today due to the warming cycle, the face of the corpse is beginning to show. The structures are emerging. The pyramids of Antarctica are not mountains. They are the spires of the city that was once the capital of the world, before the earth moved and the lights went out. The suppression of the Adam and Eve story was not merely an act of government censorship. It was the enforcement of a scientific dogma that has held humanity in an intellectual straitjacket for nearly 2 centuries. To understand why Chan Thomas was silenced, we must understand the religion of modern geology, uniformitarianism. This doctrine, established by Charles Lyell in the 19th century and fiercely defended by the academic establishment ever since, posits that the Earth changes slowly, gradually, and incrementally. It states that the present is the key to the past. It argues that the mountains we see were formed by millions of years of slow uplift, and the canyons were carved by millions of years of gentle rivers. It is a comforting theory. It tells us that the Earth is a stable, predictable platform. It allows for the long, uninterrupted timelines required for Darwinian evolution. It assures us that while disasters happen, they are local anomalies in a vast sea of tranquility. Chan Thomas threw a grenade into this sanctuary. He championed the opposing view, catastrophism. This is the view that the Earth's history is defined not by the slow erosion of wind and rain, but by sudden, violent, global paroxysms that alter the face of the planet in a matter of hours. The war between these two ideologies is not a polite academic debate. It is a fight for the control of the human narrative. The uniformitarian establishment treats catastrophism as a heresy, akin to flat earth theory or witchcraft. When Immanuel Velikovsky published Worlds in Collision in 1950, suggesting that planetary bodies moved and caused catastrophes on Earth, the scientific community didn't just disagree with him. They tried to destroy him. They boycotted his publisher, fired professors who supported him, and labeled him a pseudo-scientist. John Thomas faced the same invisible wall. The academic gatekeepers know that if they admit the reality of the crustal slip, they have to rewrite every textbook in every library. They have to admit that their carbon dating is flawed because the soil layers were mixed by floods. They have to admit that their models of human civilization are wrong. But most importantly, they have to admit that they, the experts, have been blind to the most significant force in nature. There is a massive psychological and financial incentive to maintain the lie. Careers, tenure, research grants, and reputations are built on the uniformitarian model. To accept Thomas's theory is to admit that the entire foundation of modern geology is built on sand that was deposited by a flood they refuse to acknowledge. However, the Earth itself keeps producing evidence that shatters the uniformitarian model, evidence that Thomas pointed to with the tenacity of a prosecutor. The most damning of these are polystrate fossils. Shuhuret. In coal mines and canyon walls around the world, geologists frequently find fossilized tree trunks standing vertically, cutting through multiple layers of sedimentary rock. According to the Standard Model, these rock layers took millions of years to accumulate, depositing 1 millimeter of dust at a time. If that were true, the tree would have rotted away long before the sediment reached the top. A tree cannot stand for 1 million years waiting to be buried. The only way a vertical tree can be fossilized through multiple layers of rock is if all those layers were deposited instantly in a massive slurry of mud and water that hardened rapidly. This is the Adam and Eve flood. It proves that the geologic column is not a timeline of millions of years, but a snapshot of a single bad day. The establishment ignores these anomalies. They call them local floods, or exceptions. But a global pattern of exceptions is not an exception. It is the rule. Furthermore, the existence of erratic boulders defies the slow change model. We find massive boulders weighing hundreds of tons perched on top of mountains or in the middle of plains where they do not geologically belong. Mainstream science says glaciers moved them over thousands of years, but the physics of ice flow cannot explain how some of these rocks were lifted across valleys or deposited in areas where glaciers never existed. Thomas argues these are the pebbles tossed by the oceanic tidal waves. When a wall of water 2 miles high hits a mountain range, it tosses boulders like confetti. The sheer violence required to move these stones matches the supersonic winds and the displacement of the crust, not the slow creep of ice. The cognitive dissonance required to look at a 300-ton rock perched on a peak and say, "A glacier did it," is staggering, but it is necessary to protect the timeline. We see this same denial in the field of paleontology. The sudden extinction of the megafauna, the mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant sloths, around 12,000 years ago, is a mystery to the mainstream. They blame overhunting by Clovis people. They want us to believe that a few bands of humans with stone spears managed to wipe out millions of aggressive, giant animals across multiple continents simultaneously. It is a laughable theory. It is a mathematical impossibility. But it is preferable to the alternative, that the animals were wiped out by a geophysical reset. The overkill hypothesis puts humans in control. The cataclysm hypothesis puts us at the mercy of the planet. Science, in its modern arrogance, hates to be at the mercy of anything. This is why they love the asteroid theory for the dinosaurs, but hate the pole shift for humans. An asteroid is a random, external bad luck event. It's a rogue rock. We can, theoretically, shoot it down. But a pole shift is internal. It is the Earth's own mechanism. It is inevitable. You cannot shoot down the Earth's core. Admitting the pole shift cycle creates a sense of helplessness that governments and scientists despise. However, the cracks in the dam are appearing. The recent acceptance of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a form of soft disclosure. Scientists are finally admitting that a massive cataclysm happened 12,800 years ago. They are admitting the fire, the flood, and the sudden climate change. But they are blaming it on a comet. Why? Because a comet is a safe explanation. It preserves the randomness. It allows them to say, wow, that was a close call, glad that's over. They are terrified to take the next step, the step Chan-Thomas took, and realize that the comet, or solar micronova, wasn't a random accident, but the trigger for the crustal slip. They are slowly moving the window of acceptance, feeding the public the truth in bite-sized pieces so we don't choke on the panic. They admit the disaster happened, but they still lie about the mechanism and the schedule. They are trying to reconcile the evidence of the past with the illusion of safety in the present. But the work of Chan-Thomas stands as an indictment of this cowardice. He showed that true science requires the courage to look at the data even when it terrifies you. The CIA classified his book not because it was bad science, but because it was forbidden science. It was the truth that breaks the spell of the ivory tower. If the science is clear and the history is written in the rocks, the burning question remains: why hide it? Why would the government, an entity ostensibly created to protect the people, deliberately withhold the single most important fact about our existence? To answer this, we must look at the logic of governance through the lens of the Brookings Report. Commissioned by NASA in 1960, just 6 years before the classification of Chan-Thomas's book, this report, titled Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs, contained a section that has become infamous in conspiracy circles. It explicitly discussed the potential societal impact of discovering extraterrestrial life or artifacts on other planets. The sociologists and psychologists who wrote the report concluded that such a discovery could cause the disintegration of society. They warned that religious institutions, the scientific establishment, and the rule of law might collapse under the ontological shock. The recommendation was clear. If the truth is too shattering, silence is the only option. The government decided that the public is a child that cannot handle the monsters under the bed. Apply this logic to the Chan-Thomas cataclysm. If the government were to announce tomorrow, citizens, The Earth's crust is going to detach in 20 years. The winds will be supersonic, the oceans will drown the continents, and 99% of you will die. What would happen? It would not be a scene of orderly preparation. It would be total, immediate chaos. The stock market would go to zero in seconds because money has no value in an apocalypse. People would stop going to work. The power grid would fail because no one would man the stations. Law enforcement would dissolve as officers rushed home to be with their families. The supply chain would break. Famine, rioting, and anarchy would consume the world long before the first wind blew. The government realizes that civilization is a fragile psychological construct. It only functions because we believe in tomorrow. If you remove the promise of tomorrow, the social contract evaporates today. Therefore, to keep the lights on, to keep the peace, and to maintain their own power for as long as possible, they must lie. The cover-up is not an act of malice. In their twisted view, it is an act of mercy. They are letting us enjoy the party before the lights go out. But the cover-up goes deeper than just silence. It involves active misdirection. We have to look at the climate change narrative with a suspicious eye. Is it possible that the genuine changes happening to our planet, the melting ice, the erratic weather, the warming oceans, are being repackaged? The government admits the climate is changing, but they blame it entirely on CO2 and human activity. Why? Because if it's human-made, it implies we can fix it. It implies we are in control. It allows them to pass taxes, create regulations, and engineer society. It gives the population a sense of agency and a target for their anxiety. But if the climate change is actually caused by the precursors of a pole shift, internal heating from the core, and solar forcing, then there is no tax that can fix it. There is no carbon credit that can stop the crust from slipping. By focusing the world's attention on global warming, they are creating a massive diversion. They are keeping the scientists and the activists busy looking at the atmosphere, so they don't look at the magnetic field. It is a sleight of hand. They are selling us a solvable problem to hide the unsolvable one. This strategy of mass pacification also explains the entertainment industry's obsession with disaster movies. We are bombarded with films like 2012, The Day After Tomorrow, and Don't Look Up. This is a psychological technique known as predictive programming or desensitization. By showing us the apocalypse in a fictional CGI format, they normalize the idea. When we see the real signs, our subconscious dismisses them as just like in the movies. It blurs the line between reality and fantasy. The movie 2012, explicitly based on the crustal displacement theory, they even mentioned Charles Hapgood, was not a warning. It was a mockery. It turned the end of the world into a popcorn flick. This keeps the public in a state of cognitive dissonance. We are entertained by our own destruction, but we refuse to believe it is real. Meanwhile, behind the curtain of silence, the government is busy. The classification of Thomas's book coincided with the massive expansion of the deep underground military bases. DUMBs. The logic is simple. If the surface is going to be scrubbed clean, you have to go down. The trillions of dollars missing from the Pentagon budget. The famous $3 trillion announced by Donald Rumsfeld on September 10th, 2001. Where did it go? You cannot hide that kind of money on the surface. You hide it in concrete and steel, miles beneath the Ozarks or the Rockies. They are building the modern Ark. But unlike Noah's Ark, which took the animals, this ark is for the elite, the scientists, the military, and the genetic seeds of the future. The cover-up buys them the time to build. Every day that we go to work, paying our taxes and believing the lie, we are funding the bunkers that will be used to lock us out. The Adam and Eve file is the receipt for this betrayal. It proves that there are two timelines, the public timeline of progress and democracy, and the classified timeline of preparation and survival. The CIA didn't hide the book to protect us from panic. They hid it to protect themselves from us. Because if 8 billion people realized they had been left off the guest list for the future, the revolution would be instantaneous. If John Thomas's theory was merely a terrifying campfire story about the ancient past, we could perhaps sleep soundly at night. But the reason the Adam and Eve story has resurfaced with such viral intensity in the 21st century is that the mechanism he described is no longer theoretical. It is observable. We are not waiting for the signs of the shift. We are living through them. The most glaring and undeniable alarm bell is ringing in the Arctic. For centuries, the magnetic North Pole was a relatively stable point, meandering slowly around the Canadian archipelago. Navigators relied on it. But starting in the mid-19th century and accelerating violently in the 1990s, the pole began to run. It didn't just drift, it sprinted. It left Canada, crossed the international date line, and is now racing toward Siberia at speeds exceeding 34 miles per year. This is unprecedented in recorded history. The movement is so erratic and rapid that the World Magnetic Model, the algorithm used by military navigation systems, GPS, and commercial airlines, has to be updated ahead of schedule because the pole is moving faster than the math can predict. Why is the pole moving to Siberia? Because the magnetic blob deep inside the Earth's outer core is changing. The dynamo is destabilizing. According to Thomas's theory, the excursion of the poles is the precursor to the flip. The magnetic north is not just going on a vacation, it is unhooking itself from its geographic anchor. It is the wobble before the topple. But the movement of the pole is just the compass needle. The real danger is the shield itself. The Earth's magnetic field is our only defense against the sun and the galaxy. It is the invisible force field that keeps our atmosphere from being stripped away and our biology from being irradiated. And it is collapsing. Data from the European Space Agency's Swarm satellite constellation shows that the magnetic field is weakening at a rate 10 times faster than previously thought. We have lost roughly 10 to 15% of our field strength in the last 150 years. In the world of geophysics, that is a freefall. The most terrifying manifestation of this collapse is the South Atlantic Anomaly, SAA. This is a massive region over South America and the southern Atlantic Ocean, where the magnetic field has become dangerously weak, effectively creating a dent or a hole in the shield. It is so bad that satellites passing over this region frequently suffer from glitches or single-event upsets because they are being bombarded by cosmic radiation that the shield should be stopping. The Hubble Space Telescope has to turn off its sensors when it flies through it. The SAA is expanding. It is splitting into 2 separate lobes and moving westward. This is not just a localized anomaly. It is the spreading rot of the entire system. It is the physical manifestation of the viscosity drop Thomas warned about. As the field weakens, the hold on the crust loosens. The SAA is the breach in the hull of the Titanic, and the water is pouring in. This magnetic collapse explains the chaotic weather patterns that the media labels climate change. While carbon emissions are a factor, they cannot explain the sheer violence and strangeness of modern weather. The electric universe theory connects the dots. As the magnetic shield weakens, more galactic cosmic rays, GCRs, penetrate the atmosphere. Cosmic rays are high-energy particles that act as nucleation seeds for clouds. More cosmic rays mean more cloud cover, more precipitation, and more violent storms. This is why we are seeing 1,000-year floods happening every 6 months. It's why we see hail the size of softballs. Furthermore, the magnetic field dictates the path of the jet stream. Historically, the jet stream flowed in a relatively tight, straight band, zonal flow. Now it has become wavy and erratic, meridional flow. It dips deep south, bringing Arctic air to Texas, the Texas freeze, and loops deep north, bringing Saharan heat to London. The atmosphere is mixing vertically because the magnetic containment is failing. We are seeing the atmosphere unlocking from its stable rotation, mimicking the precursor turbulence of the crustal slip. The weather isn't just getting warmer, it's getting broken. Beneath our feet, the signals are equally disturbing. We are witnessing a statistical increase in deep focus earthquakes, quakes that happen hundreds of miles down in the mantle. These are not surface crunches. These are deep structural groans of the planet. They indicate that the magma currents are shifting. We are seeing the rotation of the Earth itself glitching. In recent years, the Earth has been spinning faster, breaking records for the shortest days ever recorded. Scientists are baffled, proposing everything from melting glaciers to atmospheric drag. But in the context of the Adam and Eve theory, a change in rotation speed is a critical warning sign. It suggests that the core and the mantle are decoupling. The clutch of the planet is slipping. The slight shudder in the spin is the same feeling you get in a car right before it spins out of control. It is the loss of traction. Then there are the sounds. All over the world, from Canada to Ukraine to Indonesia, people are recording eerie, metallic groaning noises coming from the sky or the ground. These sky trumpets, or earth groans, sound like metal grinding on metal. Scientific explanations range from construction noise to atmospheric pressure changes, but none fit the global scale of the phenomenon. Chan Thomas would argue that we are hearing the lithosphere under tension. We are hearing the rocks crying out as the torque builds up. It is the acoustic signature of a planet about to snap. Even the animal kingdom feels it. We are seeing mass beachings of whales and dolphins, animals that navigate by magnetic field lines. When the lines shift or twist, the animals are led into shallow waters to die. Migratory birds are flying off course. The biological compasses are failing because the master magnet is failing. The signs are not subtle. They are screaming at us. We are living in a time where the North Pole is running away. The South Atlantic is opening up to space radiation. The weather has gone mad. The Earth is spinning faster, and the ground is groaning. To look at this data and say business as usual is the height of denial. The Adam and Eve event is not a distant threat. The precursors are here. We are in the transition phase. The system is visibly preparing for the reset. The CIA knows this. The elite know this. The rush to build bunkers, the desperation to control the narrative, the obsession with space colonization, It is all a reaction to the data points we are seeing right now. The dashboard is flashing red. The question is not if the engine will blow, but how long we can keep driving before it does. To view the space race of the 1960s solely as a geopolitical flexing contest between the United States and the Soviet Union is to miss the forensic motive hiding behind the propaganda. While the public was told that the race to the moon was about capitalism versus communism, the timing suggests a desperate scramble for data. Chan Thomas was not just an author, he was an electrical engineer employed by McDonnell Douglas and TRW, working on classified programs for the United States Air Force. He was inside the machine that built the rockets. It is highly probable that the motivation to get to the moon was not to plant a flag, but to inspect a celestial crime scene. The moon is the Earth's silent witness. It has no atmosphere to erode the evidence, no oceans to wash away the scars, and no tectonic plates to bury the past. If the sun undergoes a cyclical micronova that devastates the Earth, the moon would bear the same burns, preserved in the vacuum of space like a pristine fingerprint. When the Apollo astronauts landed, they didn't just play golf. They collected soil samples that contained a terrifying anomaly: tiny, glass-glazed beads and rocks that appeared to have been subjected to intense, instantaneous heat. Mainstream science dismisses this as the result of micrometeorite impacts over billions of years. But the concentration and the distribution of this glazing suggest a massive, systemic thermal event, a solar flash that cooked the surface of the moon. Thomas and other catastrophists argue that NASA went there to confirm the solar cycle. Once they found the glass, they knew the clock was real. This explains why, after the frantic pace of the Apollo program, humanity suddenly stopped going back. We didn't stop because we ran out of money. We stopped because we found what we were looking for. This interplanetary forensics investigation extends to Mars. The red planet is a graveyard of a planetary catastrophe. The Valles Marineris is a canyon system that dwarfs the Grand Canyon, stretching 4,000 kilometers across the Martian surface. Uniformitarian scientists try to explain it as water erosion or tectonic cracking, but the visual evidence resembles something far more violent: an electrical scar. In the electric universe model, which aligns with the solar micronova theory, a massive plasma discharge from the sun or a passing planetary body could have arced across Mars, gouging out the Valles Marineris in a matter of minutes, not millions of years. This discharge would have stripped away the Martian atmosphere and boiled its oceans, turning a living world into a dead, rusted husk. If the elite believe that Earth is next in line for a similar, albeit lesser, solar event, then Mars serves as a grim reminder of what happens when the magnetic shield fails completely. The obsession with life on Mars, the Cydonia face, the pyramids, the traces of water, is not about finding microbes. It is about finding out if a civilization like ours once lived there and was wiped out by the same 6,000-year or 12,000-year cycle. We are probing the corpse of our neighbor to understand the disease that is coming for us. This leads to the darkest corner of the space connection. The Secret Space Program, SSP. Conspiracy theory has long held that NASA is merely a civilian front, a never-a-straight-answer agency, designed to distract the public with low-orbit tin cans while the real military space program operates decades ahead of known technology. If the Adam and Eve cycle is inevitable, And if underground bunkers are not 100% safe from a crustal slip that can turn mountains into gravel, then the ultimate insurance policy is off-world. The solar warden rumors, the trillions of missing dollars, and the unexplained sightings of triangular craft, TR-3B, suggest that a breakaway civilization has already built the lifeboats. They are not planning to evacuate the population of Earth. That is logistically impossible. They are planning to evacuate the genetic seeds, the data, and the chosen few to orbital stations or bases on the Moon and Mars to ride out the solar storm. The sudden push by billionaires like Elon Musk to make humanity multiplanetary aligns perfectly with the timeline. Musk often speaks with a sense of urgent fatality, stating that we must leave Earth before a great filter event destroys us. He is selling it as adventure. The Adam and Eve theory says it is an evacuation. The privatization of space is the final phase. The government has handed the keys to the private sector to build the arcs faster than bureaucracy allows. John Thomas's background in the aerospace industry provides the link between the geology book and the rocket launch. He likely saw the data from the early satellite programs, the Nimbus satellites, the gravity mapping, that showed the Earth was misshapen, wobbling, and magnetically unstable. He understood that the Earth is not a spaceship. It is a centrifuge that is about to unbalance. The rush to space in the 21st century is not about exploration. It is about survival. The James Webb Telescope isn't just looking at the beginning of the universe. It is looking for the signs of other stars in our neighborhood micronoving, building a predictive model for our own sun. Every rover on Mars, every probe to the sun, like the Parker Solar Probe, and every return mission to the Moon is a data point in the survival algorithm. They are checking the blast radius. They are measuring the solar wind to see when the gale becomes a hurricane. The space connection confirms that the threat is not just under our feet. It is in the sky, and the only way to survive the fire from heaven might be to leave the heavens we know behind. The most terrifying question posed by the suppression of the Adam and Eve story is not whether the government is hiding the truth from us, but whether we are hiding the truth from ourselves. John Thomas touches upon a concept that was famously explored by the psychoanalyst Immanuel Velikovsky in his seminal work, Mankind in Amnesia. The theory posits that the human race is collectively suffering from a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Just as a soldier returning from a horrific war might repress the memories of the battlefield, blocking out the sounds and the smells because they are too painful to process, the human species has repressed the memory of the cataclysms. We have lived through the wind, the fire, and the flood not once, but many times. Our ancestors watched the sky fall. They watched the oceans rise. They saw their children swept away by walls of mud. The trauma of these events was so absolute, so soul-shattering, that the survivors could not integrate it into their daily consciousness. To survive, to wake up the next morning and plant seeds in the mud, they had to forget. They had to push the memory deep into the subconscious, locking it away in the darkest basement of the human psyche. We are not a species exploring the cosmos for the first time. We are a species of trauma victims wandering through the ruins of our own past, terrified of remembering how we got the scars. This species amnesia explains why we treat our history as mythology. When we read about the Great Flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the burning of the world in the Norse Eddas, or the sinking of Atlantis in Plato's dialogues, we dismiss them as creative fiction. We tell ourselves they are metaphors for moral lessons. This is a defense mechanism. It is a form of cognitive sanitization. If we admitted that the dragons breathing fire from the sky were actually plasma discharges from a solar micronova, or that the angry gods throwing thunderbolts were actually planetary bodies interacting electrically, we would have to accept that we are living in a hostile, unpredictable universe. By turning the monsters into myths, we strip them of their power. We turn the real, physical threat of extinction into a bedtime story. This allows us to sleep at night. It allows us to build cities on fault lines and coastlines, pretending that the ground is solid. The Adam and Eve story is not a religious text. It is a repressed memory bubbling to the surface. John Thomas didn't write a new theory. He simply acted as the therapist trying to force the patient to look at the repressed trauma, and the patient, society, reacted with denial and anger, which is the standard response to breaking a dissociation. This psychological fragility is the ultimate justification for the government cover-up. The Brookings Report mentality is rooted in the belief that the human mind cannot handle the concept of cyclical destruction. If you tell a population that everything they build, every piece of art, every scientific discovery, and every act of love is destined to be erased by a clockwork mechanism every 6,000 years, you induce a state of nihilism. Why build? Why strive? Why obey the law? The illusion of permanence is the glue of civilization. Without it, the normalcy bias collapses. The normalcy bias is the mental state that causes people to underestimate the possibility of a disaster. It is why people stand on the beach filming a tsunami as it approaches, their brains refusing to calculate the danger until the water hits them. We are currently in a global state of normalcy bias. We see the magnetic pole moving, we see the weather breaking, but our brains tell us it's always been this way. We rationalize the anomalies because the alternative is to accept that our reality is about to expire. The skeptic who attacks the catastrophism theory with vitriol is not fighting for science, he is fighting for his own sanity. He is terrified. He needs the uniformitarian model to be true because it offers a safe, slow, predictable world where he has time to retire and die peacefully in his bed. Furthermore, the Adam and Eve cycle explains the deep-seated, irrational fears that plague humanity. Why are we universally afraid of the dark? Why do we have an instinctive fear of loud, booming noises? Why do cultures across the globe, separated by oceans, share the same apocalyptic nightmares? Jungian psychologists would call this the collective unconscious. We inherit the fears of our ancestors not just through culture, but perhaps epigenetically. The terror of the black sun, or the sky falling, is written into our DNA. It is a survival instinct. The people who didn't fear the sky didn't run to the caves, and they didn't survive to pass on their genes. We are the descendants of the paranoid. We are the children of the ones who ran first. This is why the topic of the pole shift triggers such a visceral reaction. It bypasses the logical brain and hits the amygdala, the fear center. It wakes up the dormant memory of the wind. The control system, the shadow government, weaponizes this trauma. They use the fear of the apocalypse to manipulate us while simultaneously denying the cause of it. They sell us minor doomsdays, economic collapse, pandemics, terrorists, to keep us in a state of manageable anxiety, distracting us from the major doomsday that they cannot control. They know that if the species ever healed its trauma, if we ever faced the reality of our precarious position in the solar system, we would stop fighting each other. The petty wars over borders and resources would seem insane to a species facing a planetary eviction notice. We would unite to build the arcs, or at least to face the end with dignity. By keeping the Adam and Eve story classified, they are preventing the species from growing up. They are keeping us in a state of infantile ignorance, playing with our toys in the nursery while the house catches fire. John Thomas tried to wake us up. He tried to break the amnesia. But the patient wasn't ready to listen, and the doctors in Langley made sure the prescription was buried in a vault. The ultimate tragedy is not that the world ends. It is that we forget it ends, and so we are doomed to repeat the cycle of building and dying, never learning, never preparing, trapped in an eternal loop of forgotten sorrow. We have traveled a long, dark road together. We have dusted off the classified files of the Central Intelligence Agency, stood in the supersonic winds of the crustal slip, examined the frozen stomach of the Berezovka mammoth, and stared directly into the blinding light of the solar micronova. We have connected the dots between the ancient myths of the Great Flood and the modern data of the shifting magnetic poles. The picture that emerges is not a comforting one. It is a picture of a planet that operates on a violent, non-negotiable schedule. It destroys the illusion that our civilization is permanent. It tells us that our cities are temporary, our borders are imaginary, and our plans for the distant future are written on water. The Adam and Eve story is not just a book. It is a diagnosis of our terminal condition. We are living in the final seconds of the cosmic hour. The magnetic field is crumbling. The sun is waking up, and the earth is groaning under the strain. The elite have built their arcs in the mountains and the seed vaults in the ice, silently acknowledging the truth they refuse to speak on the evening news. They have made their choice. Now, you must make yours. So, what do you do with this knowledge? Panic, despair, nihilism. Those are the easy reactions, the reactions of the liabilities. But John Thomas did not write his book to induce hopelessness. He wrote it to offer a different kind of survival. While he was a man of hard science, he ended his work on a deeply spiritual note. A note that the CIA likely found just as dangerous as the geology. He argued that the cataclysm is not a punishment, it is a graduation. It is a filter. The cycle of destruction is the mechanism the universe uses to harvest consciousness. If physical survival is the only goal, then the rats and the cockroaches will always win. But if the goal of human existence is the evolution of the soul, then the cataclysm is the ultimate test. It strips away the material world, the money, the status, the technology, and leaves you with nothing but your character. Thomas suggested that the next cycle, the one that follows the fire and the ice, is reserved for those who can maintain their humanity in the face of annihilation. The Adam and Eve of the next world are not just the ones who found a cave. They are the ones who carried the light of wisdom into the darkness. This perspective shifts the preparation from the physical to the internal. Yes, it is wise to have food, water, and a plan. It is smart to move away from the coastlines and the fault lines, but you cannot bunker your way out of destiny. If the crust slips, there is no guarantee that any specific rock will hold. The ultimate preparation is psychological and spiritual resilience. It is the ability to look at the end of the world and not blink. It is the understanding that you are not just a biological machine waiting to be crushed, but an eternal observer of the cosmic play. The ancients knew this. The Egyptians built the pyramids not just as tombs, but as resurrection machines to help the soul navigate the transition. The Tibetans wrote the Book of the Dead to guide the consciousness through the collapse of reality. They were preparing for the shift not just of the poles, but of the dimension. The suppression of this information deprives us of the chance to make peace with our mortality. By hiding the clock, the government steals our opportunity to say goodbye, to forgive, and to focus on what truly matters before the time runs out. They want us to die as consumers, unaware and afraid. The act of rebellion is to live as creators, aware and awake. The Adam and Eve story is a mirror. If you look into it and see only fear, you are still asleep. If you look into it and see clarity, you are waking up. The warning has been delivered. The signs are in the sky and in the ground. The magnetic north is racing to its meeting point. The sun is charging its capacitors. The cycle is closing. We are the generation chosen to witness the turning of the page. Do not waste these final moments in ignorance. Do not let the distractions of the media and the lies of the politicians blind you to the horizon. We are the survivors of the past and the architects of the future. Whether that future is here or on the other side of the veil, the earth will shake, the winds will blow, and the oceans will rise. But the truth, the forbidden, classified, terrified truth, will always rise faster. This concludes our investigation into the most dangerous book in the world. If this deep dive has shifted your perspective, if it has cracked the ice of your own amnesia, then ignite that like button and share this signal before the grid goes down. Tell me in the comments, do you feel the shift? Do you hear the groans of the earth where you live? Or do you think this is all just a story? I read every single one of your thoughts, and as always, the visuals were here to help you see, but the vision is yours to keep. Thank you for watching. Thank you for questioning. And until the next time the wheel turns, stay ready.